In the mud and chaos of World War I, British soldiers carried a weapon that finally gave infantry the power to move forward under fire. Stay with this story to see how one British invention quietly reshaped modern infantry warfare. When the First World War began, the British Army relied heavily on bolt-action rifles and heavy machine guns. These weapons were effective, but they locked infantry into static tactics. Attacking across open ground meant advancing slowly, often without reliable mobile fire support. Everything began to change with the introduction of the Lewis gun. Lightweight for its time and fed by a distinctive top-mounted drum magazine, the Lewis gun brought automatic fire directly into the hands of infantry units. Unlike heavy machine guns that required crews and fixed positions, this weapon could move with advancing soldiers. It was reliable, air-cooled, and far easier to deploy in the chaos of trench warfare. British troops quickly learned how powerful this advantage was. The Lewis gun allowed small units to suppress enemy positions while maneuvering, breaking the deadly stalemate of trench fighting. For the first time, infantry could advance while laying down their own sustained fire, instead of waiting for distant machine gun support. The weapon proved effective in nearly every environment: muddy trenches, shattered villages, and even aircraft. Its adaptability made it one of the most versatile weapons of the war. By the later years of the conflict, the Lewis gun had become a core element of British infantry tactics. More importantly, it changed how armies thought about combat. Firepower was no longer something delivered only from the rear. It moved forward with the soldier. Squads became more flexible, more aggressive, and more independent. The Lewis gun did not end trench warfare on its own, but it showed the way out. It demonstrated that mobility and automatic fire could coexist at the infantry level, a lesson that would shape military doctrine for decades. Born in the trenches of World War I, this British weapon helped define how modern infantry fights: advancing, adapting, and surviving under fire. As the war dragged on, the Lewis gun became more than just another piece of equipment. It became a symbol of adaptation. British commanders slowly realized that victory would not come from endurance alone, but from giving small units the tools to control their immediate battlefield. Training began to change around the weapon. Infantry sections were reorganized so that the Lewis gun was no longer an accessory, but the center of the squad. Riflemen maneuvered to support it, protect it, and exploit the fire it provided. This was a fundamental shift in thinking. Tactics were now built around mobile automatic fire rather than rigid formations. The psychological impact was just as important as the tactical one. Soldiers advancing behind a Lewis gun felt less exposed and less helpless. The constant presence of suppressive fire reduced enemy accuracy and bought precious seconds during attacks. In trench warfare, seconds often meant survival. Its reliability earned trust quickly. While many early automatic weapons struggled in mud and rain, the Lewis gun proved remarkably resilient. That trust mattered. Soldiers who believed in their weapon fought differently, more confidently, more aggressively, and with greater coordination. Beyond the trenches, the Lewis gun's influence spread even further. It was mounted on aircraft used by armored crews and supplied to Allied forces. Few weapons of the First World War showed such flexibility. Wherever mobility mattered, the Lewis gun followed. By the final stages of the war, British infantry doctrine had evolved significantly. Attacks were no longer blind charges. They were deliberate advances supported by moving fire, coordinated at the lowest levels. The Lewis gun did not win battles alone, but it made new kinds of battles possible. Its legacy did not end in 1918. The lessons learned from its use shaped interwar military thinking and carried directly into the next global conflict. Light machine guns became standard, and the idea that infantry squads needed organic firepower was no longer debated, it was accepted. The Lewis gun stands as one of Britain's most important contributions to modern warfare. Not because it was perfect, but because it arrived when armies needed a new way to fight. In the mud of the Western Front, it helped transform infantry from static targets into mobile, adaptive forces, and in doing so, it quietly changed the future of war. The longer the Lewis gun remained in service, the clearer its broader impact became. It was not merely a technical improvement, but a cultural shift within the army. Commanders began to trust junior leaders more, allowing corporals and sergeants to make real-time decisions around the weapon's use. Control of firepower moved downward, closer to the fight itself. This decentralization changed battlefield behavior. Instead of waiting for orders from afar, small units could respond instantly to threats. A Lewis gun team could pin down an enemy position, allowing the rest of the section to maneuver without hesitation. Combat became faster, more fluid, and less predictable, qualities that static trench warfare had suppressed for years. The weapon also reshaped how soldiers understood cooperation. Operating a Lewis gun required coordination, discipline, and mutual reliance. Ammunition carriers, spotters, and riflemen all played essential roles. This reinforced the idea that success depended on teamwork at the lowest level, not just massed forces at the top. British forces carried these lessons beyond the Western Front. From the Middle East to colonial theaters, the Lewis gun proved adaptable to different climates and terrain. Its presence allowed smaller units to operate independently, extending British reach without relying on heavy support weapons. By the war's end, the Lewis gun had helped redefine what infantry could achieve. It bridged the gap between heavy machine guns and individual rifles, giving soldiers a tool that matched the realities of modern combat. That balance, mobility paired with sustained fire, became a permanent requirement for infantry forces. In hindsight, the Lewis gun represents a moment when necessity forced innovation to be accepted. What began as a solution to a desperate problem became a foundation for future doctrine. Long after the trenches fell silent, the principles it introduced continued to shape how armies trained, fought, and thought about war. Among the many weapons of World War I, the Lewis gun stands out not for spectacle but for influence. Quietly, steadily, it taught infantry how to move forward again, and once that lesson was learned, it could never be forgotten. The Lewis gun also changed expectations about endurance and tempo. Earlier in the war, attacks were planned around brief moments of overwhelming force, followed by long pauses to reorganize. With a reliable source of mobile automatic fire, British units could maintain pressure longer. This did not mean constant firing, but controlled bursts that shaped the fight minute by minute. Pressure became continuous, not episodic. This shift affected planning at every level. Platoon leaders began to think in terms of angles, fields of fire, and timing rather than fixed objectives alone. A Lewis gun placed correctly could dominate a stretch of trench, seal off a counterattack, or protect a withdrawal. The battlefield became something to manage, not simply cross. The weapon's distinctive design contributed to its effectiveness. The top-mounted drum allowed the gunner to fire from low positions, minimizing exposure. This cooling system reduced the risk of overheating during critical moments. These details mattered in the trenches, where even a few seconds of uninterrupted fire could decide whether an advance succeeded or collapsed. Just as important was how quickly soldiers learned to integrate the Lewis gun into their instincts. It became the sound that marked safety during movement and the signal to advance or hold. Over time, this familiarity bred confidence, and confidence changed behavior. Units moved more decisively, knowing they had immediate support. The Lewis gun's influence extended into training manuals and post-war analysis. British officers recorded how squads performed better when automatic fire was integral rather than auxiliary. These lessons were shared, refined, and passed on. By the interwar years, the concept of a squad built around a light machine gun was no longer experimental, it was standard. While technology continued to advance, the core lesson remained unchanged. Infantry needed organic firepower that could move, adapt, and respond instantly. The Lewis gun had proven this under the harshest conditions possible. In the broader story of the First World War, many weapons were louder, heavier, or more destructive, but few altered everyday combat as deeply. The Lewis gun did not promise miracles. It offered something more practical, the ability for soldiers to act, coordinate, and survive in a war that punished hesitation. That is why its legacy endures, not as a relic of trench warfare, but as a cornerstone of modern infantry tactics. It taught soldiers how to move forward again, and once that knowledge took hold, the future of infantry warfare was set. As the Lewis gun became fully embedded in British units, it reshaped not only tactics but mindset. Infantry no longer saw themselves as expendable elements feeding into a larger machine. With mobile automatic fire at their side, soldiers began to think in terms of control, of space, of timing, and of initiative. This psychological shift was subtle but powerful. The weapon encouraged patience as much as aggression. Gunners learned when to fire and, just as importantly, when not to. Ammunition was precious, and discipline mattered. Well-timed bursts replaced uncontrolled volleys. This balance between restraint and force became a defining feature of effective infantry units by the end of the war. The Lewis gun also influenced how success was measured. Progress was no longer judged only by captured ground, but by the ability to hold, suppress, and reorganize under pressure. A position secured with a Lewis gun could be defended with fewer men, freeing others to maneuver or reinforce elsewhere. Efficiency replaced brute force. Its continued use after the war confirmed its value. The Lewis gun did not disappear when peace came. It remained in service, trained with, and trusted. That longevity speaks volumes. Weapons that fail are quickly abandoned. Weapons that change how soldiers fight tend to endure. Looking back, the Lewis gun represents a moment when necessity forced armies to evolve. It was not the most powerful weapon of the war, nor the most feared, but it was among the most transformative. It took abstract ideas about mobility and firepower and made them practical at the lowest level of combat. In the end, Britain's most influential weapon of World War I was not one that shattered cities or dominated headlines. It was one that quietly followed soldiers into the mud, gave them the means to move forward, and taught them how to fight together in a new kind of war. That quiet transformation is the Lewis gun's true legacy, and why it remains one of the most important infantry weapons ever carried into battle. The Lewis gun also revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Adaptability mattered more than tradition. Before the war, many officers believed that discipline and marksmanship alone would decide battles. World War I proved otherwise. Survival depended on how quickly an army could absorb new ideas and turn them into practice. The Lewis gun became one of the clearest tools through which that adaptation took shape. As British units refined their tactics, the gun reshaped how battles unfolded at the smallest scale. Fire was no longer something that arrived in distant, thunderous waves. It became immediate and precise. A Lewis gun team could halt an enemy push, protect a flank, or enable a risky advance without waiting for higher command. This autonomy changed the tempo of combat, making it faster and less predictable. The weapon also influenced leadership culture. Officers learned to trust the judgment of gunners and section leaders, understanding that decisions made seconds earlier or later could mean life or death. Authority became more flexible, responding to battlefield realities rather than rigid plans. This evolution would echo through military thinking long after the war ended. Even its imperfections played a role. The Lewis gun was not light by modern standards, and it demanded training and coordination. But those demands reinforced discipline and cooperation. A squad that mastered the weapon became more cohesive, more confident, and more effective under pressure. In the wider scope of the war, the Lewis gun did not promise instant victory. What it offered was resilience. It gave infantry the ability to endure contact, recover from setbacks, and keep moving despite exhaustion and losses. In a conflict defined by attrition, that resilience was invaluable. When historians examine how the British Army transformed between 1914 and 1918, the Lewis gun stands at the center of that story. It symbolizes the shift from rigid doctrine to practical experience, from static defense to controlled movement. It helped soldiers reclaim initiative in a war that had stripped it away. Long after the trenches were abandoned, the lessons of the Lewis gun remained. Modern infantry tactics still revolve around the same principle it proved under fire. Small units need their own firepower to survive and succeed. That principle, born in the mud of the Western Front, continues to define how soldiers fight today. In this way, Britain's most influential weapon of World War I did more than serve its time. It changed expectations, reshaped doctrine, and helped usher infantry warfare into the modern age. Quietly, steadily, and forever, the Lewis gun's influence can also be seen in how it reframed the relationship between technology and human skill. It was not a weapon that worked on its own. Its effectiveness depended on training, coordination, and judgment. This reinforced the idea that modern warfare required not just better machines, but better soldiers, men who could think, adapt, and cooperate under pressure. As British forces gained experience, the Lewis gun became a teaching tool. New recruits learned battlefield awareness through its use, how to read terrain, anticipate enemy movement, and time their actions with others. These lessons were practical and immediate, forged in combat rather than theory. The weapon accelerated learning in a war where mistakes were brutally punished. Its success also influenced how armies planned for the future. After 1918, the British military no longer debated whether infantry needed mobile automatic fire. The question had been settled in the trenches. The focus shifted to refinement, lighter weapons, improved reliability, and better integration into squad tactics. The Lewis gun had closed the argument by proving the concept in the hardest possible conditions. Even as newer weapons appeared, the Lewis gun's legacy endured in structure rather than form. Squads built around a central source of automatic fire became standard across armies worldwide. The idea that infantry effectiveness flowed from small, self-sufficient units became foundational. What had once been an experiment became doctrine. In retrospect, the Lewis gun represents a quiet revolution. It did not arrive with grand promises or dramatic breakthroughs. It earned its place through daily use, trust built over time, and results measured in survival and progress. In a war defined by suffering and stalemate, that kind of progress mattered most. Britain's contribution to World War I was not just manpower or industry, but a shift in how soldiers fought and thought. The Lewis gun embodied that shift. It gave infantry the means to move, adapt, and endure in a battlefield that punished rigidity. And that is why its story continues to matter, not as a relic of trench warfare, but as a reminder that the most important changes in war often happen quietly, carried forward by soldiers who learn, adapt, and move on one hard-fought step at a time. The Lewis gun also altered how time was experienced in combat. Before its widespread use, infantry attacks were often defined by waiting for artillery, waiting for orders, waiting for the moment when it was finally possible to move. With a Lewis gun present, that waiting shortened. Opportunities could be created rather than merely awaited. This ability to create opportunity was crucial in a war where conditions rarely favored the attacker. Trenches, wire, and overlapping fields of fire punished hesitation. The Lewis gun allowed British units to impose their own rhythm on the fight, even if only briefly. Those brief moments, seconds of suppressed enemy fire, were often enough to cross open ground, throw grenades, or seize a foothold. The weapon also shaped how soldiers understood responsibility. A Lewis gun team carried more than equipment. It carried the momentum of the unit. If the gun failed, the advance stalled. If it succeeded, others moved. This reality fostered a sense of purpose and mutual dependence that strengthened unit cohesion in ways few other weapons could. Over time, British doctrine absorbed these realities. Training emphasized movement coordinated with fire, not separate from it. Infantry manuals reflected lessons learned in mud and smoke rather than classrooms. The Lewis gun's influence became institutional, shaping how new generations of soldiers were taught to fight. Its impact reached beyond Britain as well. Allied forces observed its use closely, and similar weapons appeared in other armies. The idea spread faster than the hardware itself. Even where the Lewis gun was not adopted, the concept behind it took root. In the broader sweep of military history, this is how lasting change usually happens. Not through a single decisive invention, but through repeated proof under pressure. The Lewis gun proved, again and again, that infantry could regain agency in a battlefield dominated by industrial firepower. By the end of the war, British soldiers were no longer fighting the same way they had in 1914. They were more flexible, more coordinated, and more capable of shaping combat at the lowest level. The Lewis gun had helped make that transformation possible. Its story is not about dominance, but about restoration, the restoration of movement, initiative, and control to infantry in a war that had stripped those things away. And because of that, the Lewis gun remains one of the most important weapons of the First World War, not just for what it did, but for what it taught. The Lewis gun's greatest achievement may have been how naturally it blended into the evolving identity of the infantryman. It did not demand that soldiers fight like machines. Instead, it complemented human judgment. The gun responded to decisions made in the moment: when to advance, when to hold, when to conserve ammunition. In a war often criticized for dehumanizing combat, this mattered. As experience accumulated, British units learned to think in layers. The Lewis gun did not replace rifles or grenades. It unified them. Riflemen protected the gun protected movement, and movement created opportunity. This interdependence marked a decisive break from earlier thinking, where weapons were treated as separate tools rather than parts of a system. The weapon also changed how terrain was used. Trenches, shell holes, and ruined buildings became positions to dominate rather than obstacles to endure. A well-placed Lewis gun could transform weak ground into a strong point or allow a small force to control a much larger area. Control, not occupation, became the goal. Fatigue was another reality the Lewis gun helped address. Continuous exposure to enemy fire drained morale as much as strength. Knowing that automatic fire was available reduced that psychological burden. Soldiers advanced with greater confidence, even when conditions were bleak. Confidence, in turn, improved coordination and reduced panic under pressure. By the war's final year, the Lewis gun was no longer a novelty. It was an expectation. Infantry units planned around it instinctively. Its sound became familiar, reassuring, and associated with progress rather than desperation. That cultural shift within the army was as important as any tactical change. When peace finally came, Britain did not simply remember the Lewis gun as equipment. It remembered it as a lesson. Future conflicts would be different, but the principle it proved remained constant. Infantry must have the means to act independently in chaos. That principle carried forward into every major conflict that followed. New weapons replaced the Lewis gun, but none replaced its role in shaping modern infantry thought. It showed that even in the most industrialized war the world had ever seen, success still depended on small groups of soldiers making smart decisions under fire. And that is why the Lewis gun endures in history, not as a symbol of destruction, but as a symbol of adaptation. In a war defined by stalemate, it helped infantry move again. Once that door was opened, warfare could never fully return to the past. In the end, the Lewis gun was more than a weapon of the First World War. It was a turning point. It gave British infantry back what trench warfare had taken away: movement, initiative, and control at the smallest level of combat. In a war dominated by machines and mass destruction, it proved that smart design and adaptability could still change how soldiers fought. Its legacy lives on in every modern infantry squad built around mobile firepower. New weapons replaced it, but the lesson it taught never faded. The Lewis gun showed that wars are not only won by firepower, but by how effectively that firepower is placed in the hands of those closest to the fight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a weapon that quietly changed history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More forgotten weapons, hidden innovations, and untold stories of military history are coming next.